Ladies and gentlemen, history is filled with moments that define the fate of civilizations, where battles are not just fought with weapons but with strategy, leadership, and vision. Today, we step back into the ancient world to relive one such momentous event, the Battle of Gaugamela, fought in 331 BCE. This was no ordinary battle. It was a turning point that changed the course of history, deciding the future of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The battle took place on the vast plains of Mesopotamia, near a small village called Gaugamela. It was here that two colossal forces clashed. On one side stood the powerful and well-established Persian Empire, ruling over vast territories from Egypt to India, while on the other, a rising power that had already shocked the world with its military brilliance. This was not just a battle for land or riches. It was a war of ideologies, a contest between an empire that had stood for centuries and a bold, ambitious force determined to reshape history. The significance of this battle cannot be overstated. The Persian Empire, ruled by a mighty king, had stood as one of the most dominant forces for over 200 years, with a vast army and immense resources at its disposal. Yet, against this seemingly invincible power stood an army that was outnumbered but highly disciplined, well-trained, and led by a commander whose military genius had already been demonstrated on numerous battlefields. As the armies prepared for battle, the world held its breath. The outcome of this conflict would not only decide the fate of the Persian Empire, but also lay the foundation for a new era, one that would influence the cultural, political, and military landscapes of the ancient world for centuries to come. This was more than just a battle. It was a clash of civilizations, a struggle that would determine who would shape the future. And so, with both sides ready, the stage was set for one of the most legendary confrontations in the history of warfare, the Battle of Gaugamela. To truly understand the significance of the Battle of Gaugamela, we must first explore the events that led to this monumental clash. This battle was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of conflict, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of dominance. It was a war between two vastly different worlds, an empire that had reigned supreme for centuries, and a rising force that sought to redefine history. At the time of the battle, the Persian Empire was the most powerful and expansive empire in the world. Stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of India, it was a vast and diverse civilization ruled by a great king. This empire had thrived for over 2 centuries, maintaining its dominance through a combination of military strength, diplomacy, and an intricate system of governance that allowed it to control such a vast and multicultural territory. It had survived countless threats and had stood unchallenged for generations. But all of that was about to change. On the other side of this conflict stood a rising power that had already sent shockwaves through the ancient world. This force, though much smaller in size and resources, had proven time and time again that strategy and discipline could overcome sheer numbers. Its leader was no ordinary commander. He was a master strategist, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of warfare. He had already crushed powerful foes, winning decisive victories that demonstrated his unparalleled military brilliance. The road to Gaugamela was paved with previous battles, each one pushing the Persian Empire closer to the brink. The two sides had already met in combat before, and despite their numerical superiority, the Persian forces had suffered humiliating defeats. These setbacks forced the Persian king to prepare for one final, decisive confrontation. He knew that if he failed to stop his enemy at Gaugamela, his empire would be lost forever. As both sides prepared for war, the tension was palpable. The Persian ruler assembled one of the largest armies ever seen, bringing warriors from across his vast empire, soldiers from Babylon, archers from Persia, cavalry from Bactria, and even war elephants from India. He chose the battlefield carefully, ensuring that it would give him every possible advantage. The flat, open plains of Gaugamela were ideal for his chariots and cavalry, weapons that had crushed enemies in the past. But despite the overwhelming size of the Persian forces, the opposing army was not intimidated. They had fought against the odds before and emerged victorious. They knew that this battle would be different. It was not just another military engagement. It was a fight for the future. If they won, an empire would fall, and a new age would begin. And so, on that fateful day in 331 BCE, two mighty forces stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. The fate of an empire, the destiny of a conqueror, and the course of history itself hung in the balance. The Battle of Gaugamela was about to begin. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just another military confrontation. It was a decisive moment that would determine the fate of an empire and the future of an entire civilization. The stakes were unimaginably high, not only for the two leaders commanding their armies, but also for the countless soldiers, citizens, and nations whose destinies were tied to the outcome. For the Persian Empire, this battle was a fight for survival. For over 2 centuries, Persia had ruled as the most dominant power in the known world. It had withstood numerous invasions, expanded its influence across vast territories, and built an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. But now, it faced a grave threat, a military force that had already shattered Persian defenses in previous battles and was marching deeper into the heart of the empire. If the Persian forces failed at Gaugamela, it would mean not just the loss of a battle but the complete collapse of an empire that had ruled for generations. The Persian king knew that this was his last chance to stop the advancing army before it reached his capital. He had no choice but to fight with everything he had. On the other side, the stakes were just as high. The invading army had come a long way, defeating powerful enemies and capturing key cities along the way. But this battle was different. This was the ultimate test of their strength, strategy, and endurance. Victory at Gaugamela would not just be another triumph. It would cement their leader's place in history as one of the greatest military commanders of all time. It would mean the end of Persian rule and the beginning of a new era, one where an entirely new power would shape the world. But failure would mean disaster. If they lost, they would be trapped deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces with no way to retreat. A single mistake could cost them everything. For the soldiers on both sides, the battle was personal. For the Persian troops, this was a fight to protect their homeland, their families, and their way of life. Many of them had never known a world without Persian rule, and they were willing to fight to the death to defend it. They had come from all corners of the empire, skilled cavalrymen from Central Asia, elite Persian warriors, archers from the east, and even war elephants from India. Each of them had one mission: to stop the invaders at all costs. For the opposing army, this battle was the culmination of years of hardship, discipline, and relentless ambition. They had traveled thousands of miles, leaving their homeland behind, fighting battle after battle to reach this moment. Every soldier knew that their leader had never lost a battle, and they were determined to uphold that legacy. They believed in his vision, his strategy, and his ability to lead them to victory against impossible odds. Beyond the battlefield, the impact of this battle would be felt for centuries to come. It was not just a war between two armies, it was a clash between two civilizations, two cultures, and two ways of life. The outcome would decide the political and military landscape of the ancient world. If the Persian Empire fell, its vast territories, wealth, and influence would pass into the hands of the victors, reshaping the balance of power across the known world. Cities would change rulers, entire populations would come under new governance, and the traditions of one empire would be replaced by another. As both sides stood on the battlefield, they knew that this was a moment of destiny. The clash that was about to unfold would not only decide the fate of two leaders, but would leave a mark on history itself. With the stakes so high, there was no turning back. The battle for supremacy was about to begin. The Battle of Gaugamela was not won by numbers alone. It was a triumph of strategy, positioning, and tactical brilliance. Every great battle in history is shaped by the terrain on which it is fought, and Gaugamela was no exception. The battlefield played a crucial role in the unfolding events, and both sides prepared meticulously, knowing that victory or defeat would be determined not just by the size of their armies, but by how well they used the land to their advantage. The battlefield, a stage for war. Gaugamela, located in modern-day northern Iraq, was an open plain, carefully chosen by the Persian king to maximize his numerical advantage. The flat terrain allowed his army to spread out, giving him enough space to maneuver his vast forces, including his elite cavalry, deadly war chariots, and even war elephants. The Persian army was massive, one of the largest ever assembled at that time, comprising soldiers from all corners of the empire. The open landscape meant they could deploy their full strength without being hindered by narrow passes or rough terrain. To further increase his chances of victory, the Persian king went a step further. He ordered the ground to be leveled and cleared of any obstacles that might hinder his chariots. This was a calculated move. His scythed chariots, equipped with razor-sharp blades on their wheels, were designed to cut through enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. On a flat, unobstructed battlefield, these chariots could be devastating. He was confident that with such a massive army, superior cavalry, and carefully prepared terrain, victory was within his grasp. But war is not just about preparation. It is about adaptation. While the Persian king had chosen the battlefield to suit his needs, his opponent was a master of tactics. He did not fear the Persian numbers or their war machines. Instead, he devised a strategy that would turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The strategy: outsmarting a vast army. The Macedonian army was significantly smaller, but what it lacked in numbers, it made up for in discipline, coordination, and superior training. Unlike the Persian forces, which consisted of soldiers from different regions with varying fighting styles, the Macedonian army was a well-oiled machine, trained to execute complex battlefield maneuvers with precision. Their leader knew that a direct confrontation would be risky, so he relied on superior tactics to outmaneuver the larger Persian force. His strategy revolved around two key principles: mobility and deception. Instead of meeting the Persian army head-on in the center, where the enemy was strongest, he planned to draw them out and create gaps in their formation. He positioned his forces carefully, ensuring that his elite cavalry and infantry were placed in a way that could exploit any weakness in the Persian lines. At the start of the battle, the Macedonian forces made a bold and unexpected move. Instead of charging directly at the Persians, they began shifting sideways, gradually moving toward the right. This was not random. It was a calculated maneuver designed to lure the Persian cavalry away from the main battlefield. Seeing this movement, the Persian cavalry rushed to intercept, believing they had caught the enemy off guard. But this was exactly what the Macedonian leader had anticipated. As the Persian cavalry pursued, they unknowingly left a gap in their own lines. The moment this gap appeared, the Macedonian forces struck with precision. A highly trained group of soldiers, hidden and waiting for the right moment, surged forward, cutting through the Persian defenses. This was the turning point. The battlefield, which had been prepared to benefit the Persians, was now being used against them. Meanwhile, another crucial part of the strategy was countering the scythed chariots. The Persian king had expected them to cause chaos, but the Macedonian forces had a plan. Instead of panicking, they calmly stepped aside when the chariots charged, creating small gaps in their formation to let the deadly machines pass through harmlessly. Once the chariots had lost their momentum, they were easy targets for infantry soldiers, who quickly neutralized them before they could turn around and attack again. While the Persian army relied on overwhelming force, the opposing army relied on speed, discipline, and psychological warfare. By pulling the Persians into an unbalanced position and exploiting their mistakes, they turned the battle in their favor. The battlefield that had been chosen to ensure Persian dominance was now working against them, as chaos began to spread in their ranks. What had begun as a battle of strength was now becoming a test of strategy. The Persian king had assembled one of the greatest armies in history, but against a tactician who knew how to use the battlefield itself as a weapon, sheer numbers were no longer enough. The battle was shifting, and soon, the fate of the Persian Empire would hang in the balance. Every great battle in history is defined not just by the strength of the armies involved, but by the brilliance of the strategies employed. The Battle of Gaugamela was no exception. Despite being vastly outnumbered, one side demonstrated an extraordinary level of tactical genius that would ultimately decide the fate of the Persian Empire. This battle was a masterclass in warfare, where intelligence, adaptability, and precision outshone sheer numbers. A master of warfare. The Persian king entered the battle with what seemed like an unbeatable advantage. He had a massive army, superior cavalry, and a battlefield specifically prepared to suit his forces. His plan was straightforward: overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers and crush them in a direct assault. But what he did not anticipate was the adaptability and brilliance of his opponent, who had spent years perfecting the art of war. The opposing commander understood that a traditional engagement would be disastrous. If he allowed the Persian army to use its full strength, his smaller force would be overwhelmed. Instead of playing by the Persian king's rules, he devised a strategy that would force the enemy into making crucial mistakes. He knew that in warfare, victory does not always go to the strongest, it goes to the smartest. The battle begins, the decoy maneuver. As the battle commenced, the Macedonian forces did something unexpected. Instead of charging directly into the Persian lines, they began shifting to the right, moving laterally across the battlefield. To the Persians, this looked like an attempt to escape or reposition, and their cavalry immediately reacted, moving to block what they assumed was a retreat. But this was not a retreat. This was a carefully planned maneuver designed to pull the Persian cavalry away from their central position, creating gaps in the defensive line. It was a dangerous gamble, but it worked. As the Persian cavalry pursued, they unknowingly left their flanks exposed, allowing the opposing forces to strike at the weakened center, breaking the Persian lines. With the Persian cavalry now engaged in the flanks, the moment of opportunity had arrived. The Macedonian leader ordered a powerful assault straight through the heart of the Persian army. His elite forces, known for their discipline and combat effectiveness, pushed forward with precision, striking at the very center where the Persian king himself was positioned. This sudden attack caused panic among the Persian troops, as they were not expecting such a direct and well-executed assault. At the same time, the Persian war chariots, which had been prepared to wreak havoc, were rendered ineffective. Instead of charging blindly, the Macedonian troops opened gaps in their ranks, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through before quickly closing formation again. This level of battlefield coordination was something the Persian army had not encountered before. The chariots, which had been expected to break enemy lines, ended up being neutralized almost immediately. Psychological warfare, turning fear into victory. Beyond physical tactics, there was another weapon at play: psychological warfare. The Persian king had built his reputation on being the ruler of the largest empire in the world. His soldiers believed they were fighting for an invincible empire, one that had stood for centuries. But as they saw their formations breaking, their king's position under attack, and their chariots failing, doubt began to spread. In battle, morale is just as important as weapons, and once an army starts to believe it is losing, defeat becomes inevitable. The opposing army, on the other hand, fought with unmatched discipline and confidence. They had been trained for moments like this. Their leader had never lost a battle, and they believed in his ability to outthink and outfight any opponent. While the Persian army started to waver, their enemies pushed forward with relentless determination, sensing that victory was within reach. A battlefield transformed. The tactics employed at Gaugamela were revolutionary for their time. Rather than relying on brute force, the battle was won through deception, coordination, and the ability to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The Persian king had expected a conventional battle, where numbers would decide the victor. But he found himself facing an opponent who did not play by those rules. As the battle unfolded, the carefully laid Persian plans unraveled, while the opposing forces executed their maneuvers with near-perfect precision. What had begun as a contest of strength had become a contest of strategy, and the more adaptable, disciplined force was emerging victorious. Though the battle was still ongoing, the tide had begun to turn. The Persian king, once confident in his overwhelming numbers, now found himself facing a situation that was slipping out of his control. The brilliance of battlefield tactics had begun to shape the outcome, and soon, the fate of an empire would be sealed. As the sun rose over the plains of Gaugamela, two mighty armies stood face to face, each knowing that the battle ahead would decide the fate of an empire. On one side stood the Persian forces, an immense army gathered from across the vast empire, forming an almost endless line of warriors, cavalry, archers, and war chariots. On the other side stood a smaller but highly disciplined force, an army that had already defeated the Persians in previous battles and was now poised to deliver the final blow. The battlefield, a wide and open plain, had been carefully chosen by the Persian king to maximize his numerical advantage. The sheer size of his army was meant to intimidate and overwhelm his opponent. His ranks stretched for miles, with different contingents from across the empire ready to engage in battle. Persian heavy cavalry, known for their devastating charges, waited eagerly, while the deadly scythed chariots, with their spinning blades, prepared to slice through enemy ranks. At the center of it all stood the Persian king himself, surrounded by his elite guard, watching as his forces prepared for what he believed would be a decisive victory. But across the battlefield, the opposing forces stood unshaken. Though outnumbered, they were not afraid. Their leader had trained them for years in the art of war, perfecting their ability to fight as a single, well-coordinated unit. Their formation was carefully arranged, the famous phalanx at the center, shielded infantry protecting the flanks, and elite cavalry waiting for the moment to strike. Each soldier knew his role, and each one trusted in the leadership that had brought them this far. The first movements. The battle began with the Persian war chariots charging forward. These chariots were designed to break enemy lines, their sharp blades spinning and cutting down anything in their path. Dust rose from the battlefield as they thundered ahead, their drivers urging the horses to full speed. The Persian king had seen these chariots win battles before, and he expected them to do the same again. But the Macedonian forces had anticipated this move. Instead of standing firm and being cut down, they executed a brilliant counter-tactic. As the chariots approached, the infantry lines suddenly parted, creating gaps that allowed the chariots to pass harmlessly through. The drivers, now separated from their main army, found themselves surrounded and quickly eliminated by the disciplined foot soldiers. The deadly Persian war machines had been neutralized in moments. At the same time, the Persian cavalry launched an assault on the flanks, hoping to encircle the enemy. Thousands of horsemen charged, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight, as they aimed to strike at the vulnerable sides of the enemy formation. But the opposing cavalry had been waiting. They met the charge with precision, using superior training and maneuverability to counter the larger Persian forces. Skilled horsemen engaged in brutal combat, swords clashing, arrows flying, and dust filling the air as the cavalry battle turned into a chaotic struggle. The center of the battle. While the cavalry fought fiercely on the flanks, the main Persian force engaged the Macedonian phalanx in the center. This was the moment of truth. The Persian king had hoped to break through with sheer numbers, but the phalanx was one of the most disciplined formations in military history. Armed with long spears and locked shields, the soldiers formed an impenetrable wall, pushing forward with relentless force. The Persians fought back fiercely, using their archers to rain down arrows and their heavy infantry to try and break through the lines. The clash was brutal. Shields splintered, swords clashed, and warriors fell on both sides. The battlefield turned into a frenzy of combat, with neither side willing to give an inch. The Persian king, watching from his command position, saw that his army was still holding its ground, but something was wrong. His enemy was not breaking. A crucial maneuver. Then, at the perfect moment, the opposing leader executed a daring and unexpected move. His forces had been slowly shifting throughout the battle, drawing the Persian cavalry further away from the main fight. And now, he saw the opportunity he had been waiting for, a gap in the Persian lines. With a single command, he led a direct assault straight toward the Persian king's position. As his elite forces charged, cutting through the weakened Persian center, panic began to spread among the Persian ranks. The king himself was now in danger, and his bodyguards struggled to hold back the attackers. Soldiers who had once fought with confidence now wavered as they saw their leader's position threatened. The clash of armies had reached its peak, but the momentum was shifting. One side was executing a flawless strategy, while the other, despite its overwhelming numbers, was beginning to falter. The Battle of Gaugamela was entering its decisive phase, and soon, the fate of an empire would be determined. Every great battle has a moment when the tide shifts, when one side gains the upper hand, and victory begins to take shape. At Gaugamela, that moment was not determined by sheer force alone, but by intelligence, strategy, and the ability to exploit the enemy's weaknesses at precisely the right time. The battle had raged fiercely, with both armies locked in brutal combat, but now, the balance of power was about to tip in a dramatic and decisive way. The Persian king's fatal mistake. Throughout the battle, the Persian king had relied on his army's overwhelming numbers to secure victory. He had positioned his troops to surround and crush the smaller Macedonian force, using his cavalry to attack from the flanks, while his massive infantry pressed forward in the center. On paper, his strategy seemed sound. If he could encircle the enemy, their fate would be sealed. But war is not just about numbers. It is about timing, adaptability, and reading the battlefield correctly. The Persian king, believing he was in control, did not realize that his enemy had anticipated this very tactic and had set a trap in return. As the battle unfolded, the Persian cavalry on the right flank became overextended, lured further and further away from the main force. They had expected to encircle the Macedonian army, but in doing so, they left a crucial gap in their own lines. This was the opportunity the opposing commander had been waiting for. He saw the opening, and without hesitation, he struck. His elite forces, hidden until the perfect moment, surged forward like a spear, driving straight into the heart of the Persian army. Their target was not just any part of the battlefield. It was the very center where the Persian king himself was stationed. A lightning strike at the Persian center. The charge was swift and devastating. The disciplined soldiers, fighting with precision and determination, cut through the Persian lines with brutal efficiency. The Persian troops in the center, already struggling to hold back the Macedonian phalanx, suddenly found themselves under attack from a second direction. Chaos erupted. Soldiers who had been focused on holding the front line were now forced to turn and defend their king's position. The carefully arranged Persian formation began to unravel. For the first time, real fear spread through the Persian ranks. The sight of their king's position under direct attack sent waves of panic through the army. In ancient warfare, the presence of a king on the battlefield was a symbol of strength and unity. If he stood firm, his soldiers would fight with unwavering determination. But if he wavered, if he showed even a moment of hesitation, it could spell disaster. The king's critical decision. At this crucial moment, the Persian king had to make a choice. His army was still massive, and if he could rally his forces, he might still turn the tide. But the charge against his position was fierce, and the enemy forces were cutting down his personal guards one by one. His chariots had failed, his cavalry was scattered, and his once impenetrable battle lines were now breaking apart. Then came the decision that would change history. Instead of standing his ground and rallying his troops, the Persian king chose to retreat. He turned his horse and fled the battlefield, accompanied by his remaining bodyguards. The moment his soldiers saw their leader abandoning the fight, the morale of the entire Persian army collapsed. Panic spread like wildfire. What had been a fierce, evenly matched battle just moments before now became a chaotic rout. The Persian soldiers, seeing their king in retreat, lost all will to fight. Some tried to hold their ground, but many more broke ranks and fled in different directions, hoping to escape the battlefield alive. The once mighty Persian army, the largest in the known world, was now falling apart. The pursuit begins. With the enemy in full retreat, the opposing forces wasted no time in pressing their advantage. The cavalry, which had fought so fiercely on the flanks, now turned their focus to cutting down the fleeing Persian troops. The once dominant Persian army was now being hunted, its soldiers running for their lives as the battlefield turned into a scene of utter destruction. The turning point had come. The battle was no longer about strategy, it was about survival. The empire that had ruled for centuries was now crumbling before the eyes of its own soldiers. The fate of the Persian world had been sealed, and a new power was rising to take its place. In the chaos of battle, there comes a moment when an army no longer fights as a single force but as scattered individuals, each concerned only with survival. At Gaugamela, This moment came when the Persian king, once the symbol of his empire's strength, chose to abandon the battlefield. What had been a well-organized and numerically superior army just moments before was now breaking apart, its soldiers desperately trying to escape the wrath of a disciplined and relentless enemy. The power of psychological defeat. Ancient battles were not only contests of strength and tactics, they were battles of morale. As long as soldiers believed they had a chance to win, they would fight with courage. But the moment doubt crept into their minds, even the strongest army could crumble. This is exactly what happened to the Persians at Gaugamela. For hours, they had fought bravely, believing that their king's immense army would eventually overwhelm the enemy. They had endured the relentless assaults of the Macedonian Phalanx, the brutal clashes of cavalry, and the shock of seeing their war chariots rendered useless. But even then, they had held on, believing that victory was still possible. However, when they saw their king fleeing the battlefield, their confidence was shattered. Soldiers who had once stood firm now questioned why they should continue fighting if their own ruler had abandoned them. The sight of their leader retreating, accompanied only by his closest guards, sent a wave of panic through the Persian ranks. In that moment, the battle was no longer about winning, it became about survival. From battle to chaos. As the Persian king disappeared into the distance, his army lost all coordination. Officers shouted orders, but no one listened. Some units, particularly those who were still locked in direct combat, tried to hold their positions. But as they looked around and saw other soldiers running, their resolve broke. What had once been a grand army of tens of thousands now became a stampede. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in all directions. The battlefield, once a site of fierce and organized combat, turned into a scene of chaos. The very advantage that had given the Persians confidence, their overwhelming numbers, now worked against them. As thousands of soldiers tried to escape at the same time, they collided with one another, trampling their own comrades in the panic. The Persian cavalry, which had once charged fearlessly into battle, now rode at full speed in the opposite direction, desperate to get away. Infantrymen, realizing they could not outrun the mounted warriors pursuing them, scattered across the open plains, hoping to find shelter. The sound of clashing weapons was now replaced by the cries of those who had been abandoned, left to be cut down as the enemy pressed forward. The ruthless pursuit. Seeing the Persian army in disarray, the victorious forces wasted no time in pressing their advantage. Their cavalry, fresh from defeating the Persian horsemen, now turned their attention to the fleeing enemy. They pursued with relentless speed, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. The battlefield was no longer a place of structured combat, it was a place of slaughter. The Macedonian soldiers showed no mercy. They had fought too hard and lost too many of their own to let their enemy escape. They chased down the Persian soldiers, striking them down as they fled. Arrows flew through the air, spears were thrown at retreating backs, and swords cut through those who had once believed they were part of an invincible empire. For the Persians, there was no safe place to run. The very battlefield that had been chosen to give them an advantage had now become their prison. The open plains of Gaugamela, which had once seemed like the perfect terrain for their chariots and cavalry, now offered no cover, no protection. There were no mountains to hide behind, no rivers to cross, just an endless expanse where death followed them at every step. The fate of the Persian nobility and generals. Among those trying to escape were the Persian nobles, generals, and high-ranking officers who had fought alongside their king. Many of them had once enjoyed the luxuries of Persian court life, ruling vast territories under the empire's banner. But on this day, rank and privilege meant nothing. Some of these noble warriors, realizing they had no chance of escaping, chose to make a final stand. They gathered what remained of their elite guards and fought desperately, knowing that surrender was not an option. They fought bravely, but they were heavily outnumbered. One by one, they fell, their once proud banners now trampled in the dust. Others attempted to escape alongside their king, believing that if they could reach safety, they might regroup and fight another day. But their leader had already fled too far ahead, leaving them to their fate. Many of them were caught and killed, their hopes of rebuilding the empire vanishing in the blood-soaked fields of Gaugamela. The destruction of an empire's army. By now, the Persian army was no longer an army at all. It was a broken mass of scattered survivors. Those who managed to escape the battlefield would later find themselves hunted down as they tried to regroup. Others, too exhausted to flee, surrendered, knowing that they had no future left in the empire they once served. The battle that had begun with such confidence for the Persians had ended in disaster. Their numerical superiority had meant nothing against superior tactics, discipline, and strategy. Their chariots, their cavalry, and their massive infantry formations had all failed. And above all, their leader had abandoned them at the most critical moment. The collapse of the Persian army at Gaugamela was not just a military defeat, it was the symbolic fall of an empire. The once mighty force that had ruled over vast lands for centuries had been shattered in a single day. The battlefield was now covered with the bodies of those who had once served one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. The dust of battle began to settle, but the war was not yet over. With the battlefield of Gaugamela now firmly in control of the victorious forces, the focus shifted away from the thousands of fallen soldiers to one single man, the Persian king. His retreat had sealed the fate of his army, and now he was the primary target of the enemy's pursuit. The conqueror knew that as long as the Persian king remained alive, the war was not yet over. His empire was in ruins, his army was shattered, but his presence still represented a lingering threat. If he managed to escape, he could rally the remaining Persian forces, gather allies, and attempt to reclaim his throne. This could not be allowed to happen. The Persian king's desperate escape. As chaos engulfed the battlefield, the Persian king fled eastward, accompanied only by his closest bodyguards and a handful of loyal generals. The once mighty ruler, who had commanded one of the largest armies in history, now found himself on the run, his imperial banners abandoned, his war chariots left behind in the dust. His royal guard, though still loyal, was dwindling in numbers. Some had fallen in battle, while others, realizing that their leader had lost, simply deserted him along the way. His route of escape was uncertain. Unlike previous battles, where he had been able to retreat to the safety of his vast empire, this time there was no clear refuge. The cities that had once welcomed him as their ruler were now vulnerable, and many local governors were beginning to question their loyalty. The Persian Empire, once a unified force, was now crumbling piece by piece. With every mile he traveled, the Persian king knew that time was against him. His enemy was relentless, and his pursuers were not far behind. He could not stop for long, every pause risked being caught. His only hope was to reach the eastern provinces, where he still had some loyal commanders and reserves waiting. If he could reach them, he might be able to regroup and mount a defense. The relentless chase. But his enemies were not willing to give him that chance. The victorious army wasted no time in launching a pursuit. Elite cavalry units, battle-hardened from years of conquest, were sent to track down the fleeing king. These men were not just ordinary soldiers. They were among the best horsemen in the world, trained in swift and ruthless pursuit. Their mission was clear: capture or kill the Persian king before he could escape beyond reach. The pursuit was relentless. The enemy's cavalry moved with unmatched speed, covering vast distances each day, their horses trained for endurance and war. They followed the trail of the retreating Persians, tracking them like hunters chasing prey. Every abandoned piece of armor, every discarded weapon, and every exhausted horse left behind told them that their target was growing weaker. As the days passed, the Persian king's escape became more desperate. The land he once ruled was now turning against him. He could no longer rely on the loyalty of his governors and satraps, many of whom were already considering switching sides to save themselves. Messages were sent out, urging his remaining allies to send reinforcements, but few answered. Many of them had seen what had happened at Gaugamela, and they knew that the empire's days were numbered. Betrayal and isolation. As his pursuers closed in, the Persian king faced another challenge: betrayal. His once loyal commanders, who had stood beside him in battle, now began to abandon him. Some defected to the enemy, hoping to secure their own positions in the new order. Others, fearing for their own lives, decided that the Persian king was no longer worth protecting. The most devastating betrayal, however, came from within his own ranks. His closest advisors, men who had been part of his inner circle for years, began plotting against him. They saw that his rule was collapsing and that continuing to follow him would only lead to their own destruction. The once mighty king, who had commanded absolute loyalty, now found himself surrounded by men who were waiting for the right moment to turn against him. The final stand approaches. The chase continued, with the Persian king's options dwindling by the hour. His once grand army was no longer there to protect him, and his empire was falling apart. He had escaped the battlefield of Gaugamela, but he could not escape the inevitable. His enemies knew this too. They were not just chasing a defeated king. They were hunting the last remnant of a fallen empire. The pursuit was not only about vengeance. It was about ensuring that the Persian king never again had the chance to challenge their dominance. The hunt was reaching its final stage, and soon, the world would witness the fate of the last ruler of the Persian Empire. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just the defeat of an army, it was the moment an empire began to collapse. The Persian Empire, which had stood for over 2 centuries, stretching across 3 continents, now found itself on the brink of annihilation. The defeat on the battlefield was only the first step in a much larger unraveling. What followed was the slow but unstoppable disintegration of Persian rule. As its cities fell one by one, its leaders turned against each other, and its people braced for a new era. The aftermath of Gaugamela. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Persian world was in shock. News of the king's retreat spread quickly, and with it came panic. For years, the Persian Empire had been seen as an unshakable force, a superpower that could not be challenged. But now, its greatest army had been shattered, its vast resources could not save it, and its ruler was fleeing for his life. The cities and satraps, governors, that had once sworn loyalty to the Persian king began reconsidering their allegiance. Many saw the writing on the wall. Persian dominance was ending. Some regions, especially those closest to the advancing enemy, immediately surrendered, hoping to avoid destruction. Others hesitated, unsure whether to resist or submit, waiting to see if their king would rally a counterattack. But as the days passed, it became clear that no such counterattack was coming. Meanwhile, the victorious forces wasted no time in pressing forward. They did not merely celebrate their triumph, they pursued it relentlessly. Their leader knew that a single victory was not enough. The empire itself had to be dismantled piece by piece. They moved quickly, capturing Persian strongholds, seizing vast amounts of treasure, and breaking the remaining pockets of resistance before they could regroup. Every city that fell, every fortress that surrendered, and every noble that defected further cemented the empire's downfall. The fall of the Persian capital cities. The Persian Empire was unique in that it had multiple capital cities, each serving as a center of administration and wealth. Among them were Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, magnificent cities that symbolized the power and grandeur of the empire. But one by one, these great cities fell. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, surrendered almost without a fight. Its people, long accustomed to imperial rule, welcomed the arrival of their new conqueror. The city's wealth, art, and knowledge were absorbed into the growing empire of the victors. The same fate awaited Susa, another major center of Persian administration, which opened its gates rather than face destruction. But Persepolis, the heart of Persian culture and the ceremonial capital of the empire, was not so fortunate. It was here that the final blow to Persian supremacy was delivered. As the conquerors marched into the city, they seized unimaginable riches, gold, silver, and treasures that had been accumulated for centuries. But more importantly, they destroyed what remained of Persian pride. The great palaces, once home to the mighty Persian kings, were set ablaze. Whether this act was deliberate revenge or a moment of uncontrollable destruction remains debated, but its effect was undeniable. The flames that consumed Persepolis were not just the destruction of buildings, they were the symbolic end of Persian dominance. The Persian nobility's struggle to survive. While the empire crumbled, its nobles and officials found themselves trapped between loyalty and survival. Some fled, hoping to find refuge in the distant eastern provinces, while others swore allegiance to the new rulers in an attempt to preserve their status. There were those who still hoped for a Persian resurgence, believing that a final stronghold could be established somewhere beyond the reach of their enemies. But these hopes were in vain. The Persian king, who had once been the center of their world, was no longer capable of leading them. His authority had been shattered the moment he fled the battlefield, and now, as he was hunted across his own lands, many of his former allies saw no reason to remain loyal. Even his most trusted commanders began plotting against him, realizing that aligning with their former enemy was now the only way to survive. The absorption of the Persian world. As Persian rule collapsed, the vast territories it once controlled began to change. The conquerors did not merely defeat the Persian army. They absorbed its lands, its culture, and its people. The old systems of governance were dismantled, and in their place, new structures were established. Some Persian traditions were preserved, incorporated into the administration of the new empire, while others were discarded. For the common people of Persia, the change was gradual but inevitable. At first, there was fear of the unknown, of foreign rulers imposing their will. But over time, many adapted, realizing that resistance was futile. The Persian world did not disappear overnight. It was transformed, shaped by the new order that had taken control. The legacy of Persia would live on, but never again as the dominant empire it had once been. The beginning of a new era. The fall of the Persian Empire was not just the end of one civilization, it was the beginning of another. The world that had been dominated by Persian rule was now under new leadership, and the balance of power had shifted permanently. The conqueror who had brought down the empire did not stop with its destruction. He sought to unify the lands he had won, blending cultures, ideas, and traditions into something new. With the fall of Persia's last strongholds, the final chapter of its great empire was closing. What had once been the most powerful force in the ancient world was now just a memory, its cities either conquered or burned, its armies either dead or scattered, and its king reduced to a fugitive. The world had changed, and there was no going back. The Persian Empire had fallen, and a new power had risen in its place.